A while back, I made a video about video game protagonists. What makes them good, what makes them bad, and what makes them great. Today though, I'd like to talk about their counterparts, the video game antagonists. The people and things that give us a reason to play these games. Now, before we get into anything, I'd like to clear up a little misconception about protagonists and antagonists. A protagonist is not the same thing as a good guy, and by that same logic, an antagonist is not always a bad guy. A protagonist is simply the main character or the character who the story is being seen through. The antagonist then is the character or characters, or thing even, who are opposing the protagonist. In the game Hatred, you are an evil monster, but that evil monster is still the protagonist. In Injustice 2, if you side with Superman, then Batman becomes your antagonist, and he is a literal superhero. Good nor bad have nothing to do with this conversation. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how we can identify an antagonist. Today's sponsor, War Thunder, is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. There are over 2,000 different planes, tanks, helicopters, and ships to use in battle. Every vehicle has been meticulously modeled down to their individual components. In War Thunder, there are no traditional hit points. Instead, the vehicles suffer actual damage to their components and crew. A damage X-ray shows exactly what happens to you or your enemies as your vehicles are battered or destroyed. When you combine that system with the incredible graphics details and 4K resolution and the authentic sound effects, you get a one-of-a-kind immersive experience. My dad taught people how to drive tanks in the military, and when I told him I was working with War Thunder, he made a point to tell me just how great those tank models really are. War Thunder is free to play, and you can try it now on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. Just click the link below to get started and to get all of these great bonuses that you see here. Identifying who our antagonist is in any given game might not be as easy as you think. Let's do a little trivia. Who are the antagonists of Minecraft? Well, the Ender Dragon is the final boss, so surely he's an antagonist. Creepers are always blowing up your stuff and trying to kill you, so they also have to be an antagonist. Wolves are generally friendly and can even be tamed, so those shouldn't be an antagonist, right? Well, under most circumstances, I would say no, they are not. But it is possible for them to become hostile, and because it's even a possibility, I would still consider them to be an antagonist. Obviously though, lava can't be an antagonist. It's not alive, it has no personality, and it's never going to actively seek you out. Believe it or not though, things like environmental hazards, emotions like fear or doubt, hell, even sounds can be an antagonist so long as they are posing a threat for the protagonist to overcome, so that means that lava is absolutely an antagonist. This little exercise was to show that there are many different types of antagonists, and that no game or story is limited to having just one at a time. I've tried my best to classify these antagonists though, so let's go over those now. First, we have the multiplayer antagonist. These are enemies in a game that are actively controlled by another player, so think the likes of Call of Duty, Fortnite, really any game where you're competing with other people. Computer players don't really count though, and I would classify those under our next category, the environmental antagonist. This is a very far-reaching title, but essentially the idea is that anything that is a product of its environment and isn't written with a specific personality or character in mind could be considered an environmental antagonist. Cops in GTA, the map in Fall Guys, zombies in 7 Days to Die, all of these things are written to be in opposition to the protagonist, but usually not the main opposition. You could also break this category up into two different ones, the map and the Whittle Guys. The next classification is one of my favorites, the boss. These antagonists don't always have a well-displayed personality, they don't always even have voice lines or much anticipation, but they should always pose a major threat to the protagonist. Think the likes of Margit, or the Wither, or O-Chunks from Super Paper Mario. These are all major roadblocks for the main character and not something to be taken lightly. This category also includes, of course, the final boss, the Pokemon champions, Bowser. They are the ultimate final battle for our protagonist. A battle that may never be surmountable is against our next category, the invincible antagonist. These are people like Chris Walker in Outlast, or my favorite, the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation. You can't ever really beat these guys in normal gameplay, it's only through the narrative that they are ever truly dealt with. Speaking of narrative, the next type of antagonist is what I call the narrative antagonist. This is a harder type to really classify, but who I'd put in this category are Micah Bell or Handsome Jack. People that drive the story, but may not always be someone that you have a physical battle with. The last kind of antagonist is similar, but a little more specific, the rival. Someone that the game may pit you up against early on, so that when you face off later, the payoff is a little bigger than against a normal boss. Your Pokemon rival, Virgil in the Devil May Cry Cry series, or Sonic and Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2. These guys are purposefully meant to be reflections of the main character and are usually around the same strength or have the same amount of growth as the protagonist. So now we know how to identify an antagonist, what types of antagonists there are, but what about the most important part? What makes an antagonist good? Well, let's bring back the Dumpy protagonist chart, or I guess this time it'll be Dumpy's antagonist chart. There are 3 cornerstones of what makes a good antagonist. Let's start with the easiest corner to explain, engagement/personality. I've got a great example of an antagonist with some personality, GLaDOS.
Oh, it's you.
She is the best part of Portal for me, and I really like the Portal games, so that's saying a lot. When you first start Portal 1, GLaDOS is not the antagonist. At least you wouldn't know that she was. The antagonists are the puzzles, and GLaDOS is your robot narrator late. Robot narrator late. What is that? Robot narrator late. Can't stop it! And GLaDOS is just your robot narrator lady. But as you progress through the games, she starts to almost come out of her shell. She starts being funny, actually.
In dangerous testing environments, the Enrichment Center promises to always provide useful advice. For instance, the floor here will kill you. Try to avoid it.
Then you keep playing, and she goes from funny to threatening.
When the testing is over, you will be missed.
Even though she is essentially telling you that you are going to die, you can't help but be excited every time she talks. Then, of course, your character does escape and kill GLaDOS, but then she comes back in Portal 2, where she is arguably even better.
I've been really busy being dead. You know, after you murdered me.
I won't go through the entire story of Portal 2, but you actually end up kind of being friends with her when Wheatley becomes your enemy in common. GLaDOS easily maxes out the engagement/personality section for me, and is one of my favorite video game characters, period. Voss from Far Cry 3 is also a great example of this category, because like GLaDOS, I've got to admit he is the best part of his game. Every interaction keeps you on the edge of your seat, his character doesn't feel generic, and while he is your enemy, and he is terrorizing you throughout the whole game, you are still deep down excited to see this guy over and over. The second corner of the DAC is development/motivation. Does an antagonist have a reason for opposing you, and does that reason grow or improve throughout the course of the game? The shining example of this category for me has to be the leader of the Van der Linde gang himself, Dutch van der Linde. He's actually an antagonist for both Red Dead 1 and Red Dead 2, but I'd like to, for now at least, focus on his role in the second game. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a prequel to the first game, and sees Arthur Morgan as the game's protagonist, for the most part. Arthur Morgan is a part of the aforementioned Van der Linde gang, and Dutch starts out as his ally. As the game goes on, Dutch feels like the gang is being backed into a corner, and while being goaded on by the bad influence of Micah Bell, Dutch starts making some very questionable decisions. There are 2 moments in the game that show the changes in Dutch as clear as day. When the gang first meets Sadie Adler, Sadie pulls a knife on them. Dutch is the one to reassure her and lets her know that she's safe now and escorts her out of the burning home. Later, in Guarma, Arthur and Dutch are led through a cave system by an old woman named Gloria. Gloria demands payment for helping them out, and Dutch gets creepy. Feeling cheated and likely threatened, Gloria pulls a knife on him. Instead of the gentle, caring Dutch that we saw earlier, this Dutch disarms the woman before killing her. Sure, you could call it self-defense, but I think it's pretty clear that he isn't the same man he once was. Then, of course, Dutch eventually becomes an antagonist when he sides with Micah instead of Arthur. I think Dutch is a great example of an ally turned into an enemy, and is certainly a great example of development and motivation. The last corner of the chart is a bit tougher to explain. It's less analytical and more of like a feeling. Atmosphere and pressure. Is the antagonist scary? Does the antagonist pose a clear threat to the protagonist that will not be easily surmounted? Has the antagonist somehow proved that they are not to be trifled with? These are all ways that an antagonist can create a sense of atmosphere and apply emotional or psychological pressure to the player or to the protagonist. The first example of this that comes to mind for me is a moment that I won't soon forget. It's a little out there, and it really isn't really relevant to any story or lore, but this moment is one of my favorites. The cast of Smash Ultimate is staring down an enemy that, at one time, had bested them all. Then, out of nowhere, he appears. Sephiroth cuts the biblically accurate angel in half. His great theme plays, and it is clear to the viewer and to all the characters on screen that they are in even deeper shit than they previously were. Again, I know this isn't really part of anything, so let me give you a better example. In Breath of the Wild, we start off not knowing much about this version of Hyrule. Through cutscenes cutscenes and character dialogue, we get to hear what really happened. The Hylians knew Ganon would be resurrected, so they prepared well. They excavated the divine beasts, appointed a champion to each beast, and rolled out an army of the old Guardians. It turned out, though, that this is exactly what Ganon wanted, and Ganon corrupts the Guardians, turning them from dream allies to nightmarish enemies. They even show a cutscene of the Guardians destroying towns and, presumably, killing people. The worst part of all of this is that the champions that were supposed to man the divine beasts were all brutally murdered by Ganon's Blight avatars. Even the strongest protector of Hyrule, Link, didn't stand a chance against a whole army of Guardians, even with the Master Sword. Some people might not realize this, but Link was actually killed here. The Shrine of Resurrection where we find ourselves at the start of the game is a very literal name. Link had been killed, and he wasn't even up against the big guy himself in that fight. All of this story created an atmosphere of fear and desperation, and it was all caused by one man. Another, much quicker example of this category is an antagonist I mentioned earlier, the Xenomorph. This thing is goddamn terrifying, and because you can't actually kill it on your own, you have to be afraid of it. If you don't fear it, don't respect it even, then you will inevitably make a mistake, and it will kill you for it. We've finally got all three of our classifications, so now let's bridge the gap between the good antagonists and the bad antagonists by talking about one golden, decrepit bunny man.
I always come back.
William Afton exemplifies all three of the good qualities, but he also struggles with the three bad qualities. The bad qualities are pretty much just the opposite of the good ones: confusion and detachment, unmotivated and unsophisticated, and unthreatening and unrelated. The thing about how FNAF tells its story is that we don't actually learn that much through the games alone. Alongside the game releases, there are book releases, teasers, trailers, and posts from the game's creator himself, Scott Cawthon. When you combine all of these sources, you put together an interesting story. A story centered around one man and his lust for child blood. I would argue that with all of these materials in mind, that William Afton is engaging. He is sort of the center of everything after all, and he's the one that drives most of the story. His development is well documented, as he goes from someone who took an opportunity to kill his rival's daughter to someone who is experimenting with souls and trying to master the art of creating and controlling life itself. I'd say that he creates a good horror atmosphere, specifically in the Silver Eyes trilogy, where he lets his monstrous side run wild, but there's a major problem here. These aren't all things that we explicitly learn about in the games themselves, and this video is about video game antagonists. So, is Afton a good video game antagonist? No. In FNAF 1, the antagonists are obviously the animatronics. Sure, maybe it's Afton's fault, but he poses no direct or even really indirect threat at this point. In FNAF 2, Afton is again nowhere to be seen, so we can't really talk about him much in this game either. In Five Nights at Freddy's 3, though, he actually shows up and is our main antagonist. We play as Michael Afton, William's son, and we have to prevent Pops from sauntering slowly onto the screen. The lore we get in the game itself is interesting. We learn how Willie came to be Springtrap, and oh god, please don't tell me that's it. Well, as far as William goes, that's pretty much all we get there. I'll speed things up here, but in FNAF 4, kind of, 5, and 6 for the most part, William isn't much of an antagonist. Then, crazy enough, we play as him in Five Nights at Freddy's Ultimate Custom Night, as William Afton is being tormented by the spirit of Golden Freddy. This all to say that while William Afton may have deeper motivations explained in the books, he's just your average robot suit soul fused child murderer. He doesn't have much personality, so we grow more attached to the animatronics or even just the gameplay. And though he can kill you in FNAF 3, he's not really a threat anywhere else. I'd give William a solid A- antagonist chart if we factor in all the other FNAF media, but in the games, Billy gets like a C- at best from me. Now that I've gone on a page-long Five Nights at Freddy's tangent, why don't we dive into the negative categories a little deeper and give some examples for each. Starting with unmotivated/unsophisticated, I present to you the World Eater, Alduin. When I was a kid, I thought Alduin was a great antagonist. I mean, Skyrim is a great game after all, but is any of that really thanks to Alduin? Let me answer that very simply. No. Am I being fair? No, not really. Alduin is a neat guy, hard to be a big evil dragon and be lame, but the problem is that Alduin's character is not presented to the player in any meaningful way. The factions of the Stormcloaks and Imperials, meaningful, well represented by the literal war going on and the leaders of each side. The Thieves Guild, meaningful, well represented by guild members and naturally tied into the story. Alduin, though, is all fluff. His motivation is told to us to pretty much be, I want to eat the world. And it's not even by him. Let me read you some of his voice lines. I will devour your souls in Sovngarde. This world is mine. Arrogant mortals, your pride will be humbled. I am Alduin, most mighty of any in Mundus. Nothing, and I mean nothing, that Alduin says is of any real substance. Look it up yourself if you don't believe me. He only has like 20 voice lines, and they are all essentially, "Erg, I'm gonna eat you." Thankfully, Skyrim gets to fall back on its gameplay and world building, but man, Alduin. The next category, confusion and detachment, isn't really that far off of this same course of thinking. Elden Ring is a damn good game. Fighting is fun, bosses are mostly cool and plentiful, and there's enough weapons and armor to keep you busy for a couple playthroughs. But I've always had one big issue with the game, the final boss. Radagon is really cool. I walked into that fight and was like, hell yeah baby, it's time. He's integral to the lore, he's been built up, he's great. I have no issues with him. It's the magic space dildo that comes after his fight that I have a problem with. How on this accursed f***ing planet is the second phase not Marika? Yes, I know Marika is Radagon. I do not care. They could still have different fighting styles, they still look different, and they both play different roles in the lore. Why, Miyazaki, why is this the final boss? Yes, it's a vessel of the greater will, lick my ass, I do not care. The Elden Beast is maybe the only single boss who is not once talked about before their final battle in any capacity. Well hey, that's a good thing, that means it was a surprise. The final boss shouldn't be a f***ing surprise. Gwyn, no surprise, made sense. Nashandra, no surprise, made sense. Soul of Cinder, well, sort of a surprise, but it definitely made sense. The Elder Queef, no sense. They should have made the two fingers into a boss somehow. I mean, Placidusax already looks like them. They were there for an entire game and had communication with the greater will. Why does the Elden Beast make any sense at all? I'm sorry, I really like Elden Ring, and the Elden Beast does not make a lick of sense to me, and is certainly a prime example to me of confusion and detachment. The last category, the opposite of atmosphere and pressure, is unthreatening and unrelated. This is something that occurs when an antagonist isn't so good at their job, or has someone else do it for them, making them unrelated to the story. Elden Beast. Sorry. It wasn't easy to pinpoint a great example of this, because this honestly is the least important category, but I've got a few. First, Joseph Seed. In Far Cry 5, Joseph Seed is the main antagonist. The weird thing about that game, though, is that there are actually 3 other big antagonists that our protagonist, and thus the player, spends much more time with. John, Faith, and Jacob Seed are siblings of Joseph. John forms almost a rivalry-type relationship with the player, Faith causes you to trip on drugs and fights you in a crazy illusion world, and Jacob kidnaps you, tortures you, makes you kill people, and gives you PTSD. They all do at least a good enough job for me. I've got no complaints with them. The problem is that Joseph is built up as a godlike figure, and even though the fight with him is cool and a good display of why he's in charge, it takes way too long to get to him, and he's pretty absent from the main story beats, instead being replaced by his siblings. If he had shown up more, or had a real fight with us earlier on so that we could get a good idea of why we should fear him, then I think he would have been much more successful as an antagonist. But as he is, he's not a bad antagonist. I think he's just lacking a little. The other person I wanted to mention here is Lord Harkon from Skyrim. I know, I'm really ragging on Skyrim. He has a very similar problem to Alduin, which is sort of an all bark no bite situation. But at least with Alduin, other people seem to fear him and know that he's a problem. With Harkon, people kind of say things about him, sure, but it's more about vampires in general, or what Harkon is planning to do, and not who he actually is as a character. His easy boss fight also doesn't help with this problem. He's fine too, I guess, also just kind of lacking in this department though. And now that I've sat here and judged antagonists for a good while, I want to make something very clear. You can still like an antagonist, even if they may not objectively be very good. I think that goes with most anything else in life too, really. Just because I don't, or other people don't like something or someone, doesn't mean that you don't have to not like it. I still like Alduin, even though he's not really a very good antagonist. And if you like the Elden Beast, that's great. You're dumb, but I'm happy for you. I'd also like to say that there are hundreds of antagonists that I couldn't exactly squeeze into the script. And that doesn't mean I think they aren't good, it just means that this script is already too tightly packed, and I didn't want to go on more tangents than I already did. Don't forget to check out War Thunder. It's totally free, and you can play it no matter what console or PC you have. War Thunder is really cool and detailed, and the team behind it obviously cares about their game. Use the link in the description to get these great bonuses, and thanks again to War Thunder. I really appreciate you making it this far in the video. If you have, you should leave a like, subscribe, blah blah blah. You guys get it by now. Thanks for watching everyone, GG's.